All right, let's go to Frank Gaffney. Frank, I got a lot to talk to you about, but any thoughts on that?
Well, look, my sense of what's happening in Denmark, as in Europe more generally, is it's in a death spiral. And it's partly economics. It's partly what's happening to it politically. Of course, the thrash over Brexit, which you guys are covering brilliantly, is demoralizing. But I think somewhat masks a growing restiveness in most of Europe, particularly New Europe, as Don Rumsfeld used to call it, over what the Eurocrats in Brussels are trying to do to that region. But the bigger problem, of course, is, and it's true in Denmark, it's true in virtually all of the countries, particularly of old Europe, is the demographic one and the rising presence of and influence of not simply Muslims, but Sharia supremacist Muslims. And so the region is in crisis, it seems to me, Alex, and the economics of it are just one piece of it.
Yeah, and by the way, if Denmark is going to be such a big success, we could track to Breitbart how their migration minister actually told Somali migrants to go home and improve your own country. So could you imagine that? So if Denmark's supposed to be so great, and again, Frank, I'm not fluent on all the left's current thinking on which small homogenous socialist government is the ideal one at the moment, because again, I think it's such a faulty argument that I'm not that concerned with it. But if they were touting Denmark, then isn't that very interesting that they want to keep their population homogenous? United States, contrary to what people say about folks like you and me, Frank, we embrace that it's a melting pot. I think there is a value system that Americans have that I would like to preserve. And if we're going to import immigrants, I would like for them to want to ascribe to those values. But it's pretty over the top. They're saying, go home, Somalis, go rebuild your own country. It's kind of amazing. America, even if we wanted it, Frank, would never be a homogenous country. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, this reminds me of the old story about liberals or rather conservatives or liberals who've been mugged by reality. And I think what you're describing, Alex, is being mugged by the reality that you cannot assimilate vast numbers of people who simply don't want to be part of your society. They want to transform it into something very different. And ultimately, at some point, you either resist or you submit. And submission is going to be pretty ugly. And it's happening in parts of Europe already. And there's more in the offing, I'm afraid. Submission specifically to this rising tide of Sharia supremacism. And it's chilling. And the trouble is, it's not simply, a problem in its own right. It's a foretaste of what the Ilhan Omars and the Keith Ellisons and the Andre Carsons and the Rashid Tlaibs and so on would have in mind for America, too, if they had their way. This is the really vexing problem of our time. And again, not all Muslims want to live under Sharia. They don't want to impose it on the rest of us, but enough of them do, and the authorities of the faith certainly do, that we have to confront this. We have to be able to speak honestly about it. And if I could just segue to what you were calling earlier in the program, New Fox, I think of it actually, that sounds kind of like an improved version. Maybe it's like New Coke in the way you do it. But I think of it as faux Fox. It's not Fox as we've known it, for sure. And Jeanine Pirro, who's a dear friend of mine and a much admired, former public servant and now extraordinary, resource on her program, Justice with Judge Jeanine, which was suspended last week. And maybe again for this week, and maybe, who knows, indefinitely. I hope not.
Sure.
But the faux Fox is suppressing Jeanine Pirro explicitly, as you know, Alex, because she dared, even in a question, to connect the dots between what Ilhan Omar is doing with anti-Semitism on the one hand, and the traditions and teachings and practices of Sharia as we've come to know it.
Sure. It is interesting to know. And by the way, I haven't introduced Frank because he's such a familiar voice to all you guys. He's the president of the Center for Security Policy. His websites are securefreedom.org and Counter Jihad.
Chairman of it now.
Oh, boy. I'm sorry. The executive chairman. That's a good new title. All right. We're going to update that bio there, guys. And Frank, throw out that radio show again.
It's Secure Freedom Radio. It is available on podcasts, and it's also heard on the American Family Radio Network. Thank you for listening.
Great network. Love those guys. So Frank, so this is very interesting because Judge Jeanine, and I understand there are unspeakable truths now in our modern media era where corporations are controlling speech, and we know Fox is mostly okay with that because Fox wouldn't lift a finger when Breitbart was getting targeted. And I spoke to people very high up at Fox, and I told them when they're done with us, they're going to come for you, and that's exactly what happened. They acted like they had no idea what I was talking about when the Breitbart boycott news cycle started immediately after the election of President Trump, and the media fomented it and congratulated it. And the New York Times literally published an article how you can get Breitbart boycotted or how you can boycott Breitbart. No one cared. Fox didn't care. They wouldn't. I think the expression is they wouldn't urinate on us if we were on fire. And so now this has come to Fox, and so none of this is a surprise to me. But it is worth noting that Judge Jeanine was suspended for a rhetorical question where she suggested perhaps that the furthest extension of Ilhan Omar's worldview would be something similar to Sharia. It was not an emphatic statement. It was not a declarative statement. It was merely putting it out there that there are extremist forms of Islamic law, and we don't really know where her logical conclusion would be, but it very well could be somewhere that is completely anathema to what Americans, even American liberals, think. Even putting that out there on a platform that should be for free speech, worthy of suspension.
Well, Alex, if I may, just a slight correction here.
Sure.
Sharia law, as it's called, or I think of it as Sharia because it's more than law. It's a political, military, legal doctrine that explicitly is supposed to be the path for all Muslims to follow. All faithful Muslims govern all aspects of their lives and become the vehicle by which they will accomplish the domination of the world by imposing Sharia on all of us. Now, again, there are a lot of Muslims in this country in particular and elsewhere who don't want to live under Sharia anymore than the rest of us.
That's correct.
Don't want to be
and by the way, Frank, because we know the Soros-funded freaks are their mouths are watering at this conversation. Sure. And every time Frank and I have talked about this, we've always noted that. And we've always noted that we work with Muslims and have spoken to Muslims and have interviewed Muslims who do not want Sharia law. So this is not a blanket statement about all Muslims, but it is something that is growing in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, but more to the point, Alex, the Muslims who don't want to live under Sharia, I think, are an indispensable ingredient in staving off what the ones who do intend to do first to them and then to us. But here's my point. It's wrong, truthfully. It is wrong to describe Sharia as an extremist version of Islam. The authorities of the faith say it is the true faith. It is Islam. And so what we have to confront, and I think what Jeanine did, yes, you're right, in a rhetorical question, is ask and challenge and debate whether those who seek Sharia's triumph against our Constitution, against our freedoms, against our republic, for example, are in fact engaged in activities that are compatible with their, among other things, their oath of office. In the case of Ilhan Omar, she swore it on a Quran, to be sure, but nonetheless, she has promised to defend and protect, I believe that's the formulation, the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, how's that working if, among others, you are working with and for the Muslim Brotherhood, notably doing business as the Council on American Islamic Relations? These are the sorts of things that I think Jeanine has called for a debate about. And for that, she has been condemned by faux Fox management. She has been suspended for some period of time and otherwise, considerable reputational damage has been done to her. And the key point of all of this, Alex, is not just that this has been done to an incredibly important figure in our public life these days, but also the chilling effect that it is having on everybody else, on other hosts and on guests alike at Fox and beyond.
Yeah, and it's Frank, you and I try to contend with the left's ideas when they actually, when they're not speaking in platitudes, when they're actually putting out policies and positions. You and I try to deal with them. And now we're at a point now where if you're on the right and you state a viewpoint, you can get thrown off the air, even on Fox News, which is the best of the three networks politically. Frank, I have a ton to get to with you, and we are going long. I know we enjoy the conversation, but I got a ton to do still with you. So let's turn gears a little bit. Here's the big thing. So Ambassador Bolton's coming on the show later in the program. I have not interviewed him since he ascended to National Security Advisor. What are your thoughts? What should I ask the man about?
Well, first of all, thank him profusely for his public service. The sacrifice that's entailed in doing this for a guy like John is immense. And I am a great admirer of his, a friend, and believe that he's doing an incredibly important job. One of the things, there's so much to talk with him about, one of the things that I'm sure you'll want to get into with him is the effort that he's leading to try to bring about some kind of resolution of the disaster in Venezuela at the moment. And, of course, the president met with the Brazilian president yesterday, and they talked about a new strategic alliance between our two countries. Alex, one of the things that I would like to hear from John Bolton about is, does that create a basis for some kind of regional intervention with respect to Venezuela on a humanitarian basis alone, to prevent more of the horrors that are now being inflicted upon the Venezuelan people, and the certainty that vast numbers of them are going to out-migrate to try to flee the crisis there, the power outages, the food shortages, the horrors that are part of life under Nicolas Maduro. I think that's a critically important point. Of course, it's also important to get our hands around some of the other strategic challenges we're facing. He's been intimately involved in the president's efforts to denuclearize North Korea. I'm sure you'll talk to him about that. And another piece that's hugely important, Alex, we talk about it from time to time, but probably not often enough, is Communist China. The threat that it represents. The Secretary of Defense talked about the challenges he sees the Defense Department facing these days as, in 3 words, China, China, China. Getting John Bolton's thoughts about how do we deal with that, especially against the backdrop of an effort to forge a trade deal with them that is perhaps going to be helpful, we'll see, but it's not a panacea for sure against the
certainly not
threats that they represent.
Yeah, Frank, and it's are thinking similarly. The one place where I was curious your thoughts ahead of time is I think probably the place where I'm most confused about America's policy at the moment is with what's going on in Syria, which is incredibly complex geopolitically, which I know is a very lazy way to describe it, but it just is. There's no good actors there. There's warring factions. There's civil war. There's Iranian influence. There's Russian influence. I mean, there is. It's hard to sort out what is the appropriate. The president wants troops out, but pulling out too precipitously is just going to create one of those vacuums that tends to get filled by even more evildoers. But again, this is not a lot. This does not take a genius scholar to come up with that analysis I just gave just now. What are your thoughts on what's going on in Syria?
Well, again, I'll be interested to hear what the guy who's wrestling with it says. My own are similar to yours, frankly. It is a complete mess. Part of that is something that is a product of previous American policies, notably those of Barack Obama. Some of it is a function of the dynamics of the region that are much bigger than what's going on the ground in Syria per se. Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Russia, as you say. The fact of the matter is, I fear, Alex, that one of the underlying challenges we're going to face is that we may have taken away the physical space in which the Islamic State operates, that so-called caliphate, But the toxic ideology that we spoke of earlier, the Sharia supremacist ideology as practiced by ISIS, or for that matter by Al-Qaeda, which is also present on the ground in a lot of places, to say nothing of Turkey, which has been aiding and abetting these Sunni Sharia supremacists and has got a regime made up of them. These are the sorts of forces that, quite apart from the problems with Bashar Assad and his regime, and with the Shias of Iran and the Russians, make this a complete rat's nest. And I think John Bolton has said quite properly, we need to maintain in a very strategic way a small but active presence there, special forces, but not be more deeply entrenched or involved in that rat nest.
Okay, so let's go back a step, because there are a few other news headlines and great content there. Frank Gaffney, the executive chairman for the Center of Security Policy. I'm sorry, the Center for Security Policy. Now, Frank, let's go back a little bit. I had a Venezuela headline I wanted to run by you. Cuban doctors who are, remember, we learned this from Michael Moore, Cuba has the best healthcare system that has ever been created and has ever lived on God's green earth. And so there are Cuban doctors down in Venezuela, and they're only, according to reports that we have at Breitbart News, and this has been, the New York Times has similar reporting, that the doctors are only treating patients who support Maduro. Now, maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration. I can't imagine that even with the Maduro regime, that level of evil is actually happening, but shocking headlines.
Alex, I know you're being facetious when you talk about the glories of Cuban healthcare, but
very much so.
It's been one of the excuses of the regime. Nothing else works, but at least they've got doctors. Unfortunately, Alex, what is propping up the Maduro regime is not just Cuban doctors, who probably are told to treat just Maduro voters and supporters. It's also the Praetorian Guard that is physically protecting the person of Nicolas Maduro, the Cuban intelligence operatives on the ground there, the Cuban thugs who are maintaining control in the military and in the population at large. These are people, and by the way, the Russians are there, the Chinese are there, the Iranians are there, doing much the same with either financial support or physical assistance to the Maduro regime. And this is one of the things that I would encourage you to talk to John Bolton about. Without those external sources propping him up, Maduro would be gone. And I think with the Brazilians' help and the Colombians and hopefully the OAS and others, we ought to be pressing with maximum intensity on those foreign sources to drive them up. And with him gone, I think there's a new day in prospect. The president said yesterday.
All right. And Frank, I want to turn now to India and Pakistan, where India has vowed further action against Pakistan for attacking Kashmir. This is one we have not gotten into on the radio before, but we've been tracking it at our national security vertical at Breitbart News. Do you have any thoughts on what's going on in that region?
Sure. This is far and away the most dangerous place in the world. The Indians and Pakistanis both have nuclear weapons. They both are poised, it appears, to employ them in pursuit of their respective regional ambitions and agendas. The Chinese, by the way, I mentioned earlier, are intimately involved. They've enabled the Pakistanis to get the bomb. They have been very strategically aligned with the Pakistanis for decades, and they are deeply hostile to India. They've got their own border disputes and issues, and I think see the Indians as one of the checks, one of the obstacles to their regional ambitions, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative being just one manifestation of it, Alex, to establish and essentially colonize large parts of, Asia, but Africa and even Europe and Latin America, if they have their way. And Pakistan is critical to that. So I anticipate this is going to continue to escalate as a crisis. There was some seeming signs of diminishing the tensions a couple of days ago, but evidently, as your reporting indicates, they're still poised to go at it. And it could go nuclear, and it could go very ugly for not just that region, but possibly quite far beyond.
Wow, could go nuclear. Yeah, I do believe perhaps other than sub-Saharan Africa, this is the scariest region on the planet as well, Frank. And I think it's kind of
they don't have nukes in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the big
scary is intentionally non-specific, but I do think the stakes may be the highest here as well. So this is not a good situation, and glad that we have some experts in it. Edwin Moore doing some great reporting for us at Breitbart on this as well. Frank Gaffney, the last one today. Give me your thoughts on the just fiasco that is Brexit. I think you and I could have seen this coming, but it's still so sad to see democracy basically getting wiped out by the bureaucratic elite in Europe, with just so few prospects that honor the will of the people versus the elites in power.
Yeah, it's in a way reminiscent to what we face here in the elites, irrespective of their party labels, are more synced up with one another than they are with the people that they nominally represent. The Republicans, of course, are a case in point, the Republican leadership in the Congress, most especially here. But what has happened in the way of a betrayal of the people of the United Kingdom by the May government and by the Tory party and Parliament is outrageous and sickening, frankly. It will be interesting, as your own reporting has indicated, Alex, to see whether it has an interesting effect on the voting in the upcoming European parliamentary elections, encouraging a lot of people who don't have any more use for the Eurocrats and the European Union's elites than the people of Britain do, in New Europe in particular, but quite possibly some of old Europe as well. And if so, we may see factions developing that can further undercut this so-called European project and the globalist enterprise of which it is just one particularly awful manifestation.
Frank Gaffney, Executive Chairman, Center for Security Policy. Go to securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. We'll talk to you next week, Frank.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you. We'll be right back.